This one can get really personal, really fast. Maybe this has already happened to you and you aren't sure what really happened. Maybe you're concerned that it will happen when you start walking in a different direction. You've changed. You used to care. I've heard that more than once from people who don't understand the distance they perceive between the choice I made and the choice I used to make. Maybe there wasn't an apology from me, or I didn't rush to help the same way I had every other time before. I definitely didn't do everything I could to rescue someone from the mess they had made to appease my own guilt. And now there's an attempt to place me on the stand. They say they want to know why. But is that what it's really about? Or is it something more subtle, more deceptive than that? The question isn't, why did you change? The question is, why won't you go back to being the person who made the courtroom feel justified? Here's what the caring actually was. Not love. The rescue was never about the other person. It was about the guilt that arrived when I didn't rescue. The apology was never about restoration. It was about making the discomfort stop. The help was never purely help. It was the default program running in its most socially approved form. Care in its conventional form requires worry. Worry is the acknowledgement that something real can go wrong. And what does that require? It requires something real to be at stake, which requires the premise that separation is true, that what happens to the other person is separate from what I am, and that I am responsible for managing that gap. That means worry isn't love wearing concern. Worry is fear wearing love's vocabulary. And guilt? The feeling that arrives when I'm not caring enough, not worried enough, not present enough. That's the courtroom's most intimate move. It appoints me defendant in the case of my own insufficient love. That keeps the courtroom open, in the one place most people never think to look for it. Inside the feeling they were most certain was evidence they weren't in the courtroom at all. There is no fear in love. That isn't a comfort. It's a description of what love is. The worry, the guilt, the rescue, the performance of care wasn't love. It was the default program wearing the most convincing costume it has ever found. Here's what happens when you stop performing the caring. someone notices. And in the absence of what they expected, they reach for the most effective tool the courtroom has. You don't care. The absence of guilt on your part becomes evidence of indifference to them. The end of the rescue becomes proof of abandonment. The refusal to participate in the verdict is now confirmation that the verdict was right all along. You were always someone who didn't care. And now you've finally stopped hiding it. That is not an observation about your character. That's the courtroom refusing to dissolve. The person who is wielding care as a weapon isn't doing it maliciously. They're doing it from inside the only framework they have, the one where care requires worry, love requires guilt, and the absence of performance is indistinguishable from indifference. The weapon was always the same false premise, just aimed differently. Here's the precision that makes this the hardest room in the series so far to sit in. They are not wrong that something changed. They are wrong about what changed. What changed wasn't the love. What changed was the willingness to perform a version of love that was built on fear. Those are not the same thing. And only one of them requires the premise of separation to function. Care cannot exist without judgment. Think about that for a moment. For care to be necessary, something has to be wrong, at risk of going wrong, or at least insufficiently right. The caring is always in response to a gap between where someone is and where they should be, between what they have and what they need, between the current state and the desired state, which requires a standard, a comparison, a verdict. Care in its conventional form is the courtroom showing up in a kindness costume. And the guilt that arrives when you don't care enough, when you didn't call, didn't check in, didn't rush in to fix it, is the same guilt the apology transaction required. Same defendant, same charge, same implicit verdict that something real was threatened and you failed to prevent it. If we cannot judge, which episode 24 established as impossible rather than impermissible, then care, as it's commonly practiced, requires the one thing that was never available: complete information about what the other person actually needs. Nobody has that. It's impossible, which means the care was always a projection. The rescue was for the rescuer as much as the rescued. The help was shaped by the helper's judgment of what help looked like. The concern was filtered through the concerned person's incomplete perception of what there was to be concerned about. None of this means the intention wasn't genuine. It means the framework the intention was operating inside of was built on a premise that was never true. I no longer have relationships with some people because of this. I'm the bad guy, the black sheep, the one who changed, the one who stopped caring. But whose choice is that really? If a false premise is seen through and nothing changes, if the same patterns continue, the same courtroom reassembles, the same verdict gets issued, was it really seen? The relationships that didn't survive weren't ended by judgment. They were ended by the removal of the premise they were built on, which is a completely different thing. A relationship built on the mutual agreement that care requires guilt, that love requires fear, that the absence of performance means the absence of feeling. That relationship doesn't survive the premise being seen through. Not because someone decided it shouldn't, but because the load-bearing wall was never real. The black sheep designation, the bad guy role, those require a courtroom to exist. They require a verdict, a standard, a defendant who failed to meet it, which means the designation itself is the premise in operation. If the light is too bright for someone, for whatever the reason, from wherever they are in their own story, who moves? Light doesn't chase. Light doesn't apologize for being light. Light doesn't dim itself to make the room more comfortable. And this is the most important precision in the episode. None of that is a judgment about the people who moved. It's an observation about the nature of light. What looked like caring was the performance of guilt. Someone looked at the absence of performance and called it the absence of love. What looks like indifference now is the first honest thing. There is no fear in love, which means love was never what the performance was performing. Sit with this.